The existence of God, a scientific proof. This video examines a central idea: the existence of God is the most likely scientific hypothesis, discarding for the moment the traditional religious approach. The reasoning is based on the following explanation: order requires a designer, such as the construction of a brick house or the cells that make up the human organism. There are two preliminary conditions to accept. The first is represented by rationality, understood as the basis for accepting or not the existence of God, and the second is constituted by the consideration of the relative nature of scientific knowledge. Furthermore, it will be necessary to recognize the validity of deductive logic, that is, of the scientific method that allows the explanation of deductive reasoning and the application of such reasoning to the hypothesis of the existence of God. It will be necessary to demonstrate that the theory of the existence of God is the most plausible of the possible alternatives, including the non-existence of God, with the same degree of scientific certainty with which the existence of the nuclear force and electrons can be demonstrated. In the initial observation of the phenomenal reality around us, we must recognize the existence of forces and entities not directly observable, whose existence is often independent of human perception. An example of this is the force of gravity, the existence of which is described by a simple pencil dropped from the hand onto the table and the deviation from randomness as an indicator of the existence of such a force or entity. Of course, one must expect the skeptic's answer, that is, the skeptical objection to the existence of gravity. However, persistent skepticism that ignores the higher probability of the existence of gravity as well as God denotes a blameworthy irrationality on the part of the skeptic. Finally, the video invites the reader to a rational and scientific reflection on the argument in favor of the existence of God as the most plausible scientific hypothesis to consider. Here is the text. The existence of God is the most probable of scientific hypotheses. The existence, in fact, of an evolutionary force behind the existence of the universe and man rests on scientific reasoning and not on the power of religious faith, whatever it may be. In fact, a messy pile of bricks can become a house only if a project, an architect, and some bricklayers act on them. Similarly, a disordered pile of cells remains disordered and cannot evolve into a highly ordered complex such as the human being unless an evolutionary force or a universal mind operates upon them. This evolutionary force, better known by the term God, is capable of assembling and ordering them into a well-organized and complex biological system. Religion has no need to intervene in this area because the acceptance or not of the existence of God, as well as of the human soul, can be the result of purely rational or scientific reasoning. It should be remembered that in the scientific field a piece of data is true not if it is exact, but only if it is verified with greater probability than others. And it cannot be otherwise, since scientific knowledge is relative and never absolute. From the point of view of scientific methodology, the validity of a deductive logic, that is, of a reasoning that descends from universal premises towards particular conclusions, remains such even when these premises are not necessarily true, but only probable. Therefore, none of the truths of science can ever be considered as absolute proof but rather as relative. This is a positive fact because it allows science to search for truth in a dynamic and progressive way. In other words, a theory can be considered scientifically valid when we establish that it is the single most plausible, probably true, among all the possible logical alternatives that we know of. Therefore, the scientific proof of the existence of God will have to reflect what was said above. To affirm that God exists, it is necessary to demonstrate that this theory is considerably the most plausible among all the possible alternatives that can be conceived, in particular the one that affirms that God does not exist. In other words, we can know that God exists with the same degree of certainty that we know that the nuclear force and electrons exist. There are forces and entities that we cannot observe directly, invisible, but which exist objectively, that is, independently of any human perception. Gravitational force is one of these invisible forces that drags, for example, a dropped pencil downwards. The pencil, among all the possible trajectories to follow, upwards, obliquely, zigzagging, downwards, always chooses to fall downwards, because it is attracted towards the center of the earth by the force of gravity. This behavior of the pencil cannot be random, but must be causal because the trajectory it follows is always the same, that is, downwards, and is determined, caused, by the force of gravity. If there were no such force, then the pencil's trajectory could take different directions, upwards, obliquely, zigzagging, etc. That is, we can state in a scientific context that the behavior of an observable phenomenon is random, i.e. due to chance, if all logical possibilities occur with equal relative frequency. This is actually what happens in space where, in the absence of gravity, objects left to themselves drift, that is, they assume indeterminate directions. In the case of the pencil, however, we observe a continuous, coherent and significant deviation from randomness. In science, whenever one encounters a sensible phenomenon that, for no visible reason, shows a constant deviation from randomness, one is logically justified in asserting that its non-random behavior is due to the action of some force or entity, even if invisible. Of course, a skeptic might object that the fact that the pencil always falls downwards does not necessarily imply the existence of the force of gravity. This fall could be the result of an extraordinary coincidence of random events that determine its direction, while in the future we may find the world in total chaos and disorder with unsupported objects flying in all directions. In that case, we would then be forced to admit that all the experience accumulated over thousands of years was merely the fruit of incredible coincidences. From a strictly scientific point of view, the skeptic's hypothesis cannot be categorically rejected, however infinitesimal the probability of its occurrence. However, if he persists in his skeptical attitude that excludes gravity, he displays unscientific and irrational behavior. In fact, we have scientifically established that the existence of an invisible gravitational force is up to this point the most logical, that is, the most plausible, of all possible alternatives. The existence of God is the most probable of scientific hypotheses. The existence, in fact, of an evolutionary force behind the existence of the universe and man rests on scientific reasoning and not on the power of religious faith, whatever it may be. In fact, a messy pile of bricks can become a house only if an architect, a project and some bricklayers act on them, that is, an intelligent mind capable of devising a building project and workers capable of realizing it. Similarly, a disordered pile of cells remains disordered and cannot evolve into a highly ordered complex such as the human being unless an evolutionary force or a universal mind operates upon them. This universal mind, better known as God, is capable of assembling and ordering them into a well-organized and complex biological system. Religion has no need to intervene in this area, because the acceptance or not of the existence of God, as well as of the human soul, can initially be the result of purely rational or scientific reasoning. From the point of view of scientific methodology, the validity of a deductive logic, that is, of a reasoning that descends from universal premises towards particular conclusions, remains such even when these premises are not necessarily true, but only probable. According to the quantum theory of modern physics, visible reality does not have an autonomous and independent existence, but originates from an invisible reality. The perceived macroobjects of visible reality consist of billions of small energy packets called elementary particles in a state of relative but temporary equilibrium and continuous motion. These particles emerge from the invisible reality, pure energy, and whenever their equilibrium states are destroyed, they lose their apparent shape and consistency, they return to the invisible reality. Let us illustrate this truth through the following simple analogy. Let us imagine that we are on the shore of an immense ocean. The ocean and its depths represent the immensity of the invisible reality. Suddenly a fish jumps out of the ocean and then dives back in. The brief moment it is out of the water is a phenomenon of visible reality. At this point we should ask ourselves, is there a scientific principle that allows us to establish what is probable and what is not? Probable phenomena are those that are most random, while improbable phenomena are those that result from the action of an invisible force, where, of course, there is no observable cause. There is actually a principle, namely the second law of thermodynamics, also known as the entropy principle or Carnot's law, which answers our previous question. Entropy, from the ancient Greek inside, and trope, transformation, is a measure of the disorder present in any physical system, including the universe as a limiting case. It is usually represented by the letter S. Thermodynamics is the branch of physics that studies and describes the transformations, called thermodynamic transformations, undergone by a physical system, called a thermodynamic system, following processes that involve the transformation of mass and energy, passing from one form to another. The first law of thermodynamics is a formulation of the law of conservation of energy and states that the energy of an isolated thermodynamic system is neither created nor destroyed, but is transformed. The second law states that the entropy of an isolated system far from thermal equilibrium tends to increase with time, until equilibrium is reached. The third law of thermodynamics, known as the Nernst principle, states that at absolute zero, the entropy of a pure crystal is zero, i.e., the disorder of a system is zero. We will now examine the following statement of this second law of thermodynamics or physical law. Disorder is probable, order is unlikely. To elaborate, order, structure, and complexity are unlikely, while disorder, simplicity, and uniformity are probable. Let's try to understand this concept with some examples. Suppose we compare a pile of bricks with a house made of bricks. The pile of bricks represents disorder, while the house of bricks represents order. If we wanted to transform the brick house into a pile of bricks, brick by brick, we could logically do so in any possible way. In fact, we could take any brick from the house as the first brick, any other brick as the second brick, and so on. All possibilities, however, would allow us to obtain the pile of bricks. But in the second case, going from a pile of bricks to a house would not be possible in any way. In fact, we could not place any bricks at the upper level without first having placed an adequate number of bricks as the lower base. So, turning a brick house into a pile of bricks represents a process from a state of order to a state of disorder, or from the improbable to the probable. Meanwhile, transforming a pile of bricks into a well-built brick house represents a process that moves from a state of disorder to a state of order, from the probable to the improbable. Now, if we were to build a brick house in a wood and leave it to the forces of nature for 50 years, we would certainly not be surprised to find, after this, the house had degenerated into a pile of bricks. But if we left the pile of bricks in the same condition to the forces of nature for 50 years, we would certainly be surprised to find a well-built house in place of the pile of bricks. The surprise we would feel in this case represents our intuition of the truth of the second law of thermodynamics. In any isolated physical system, disorder will tend to increase until it reaches the state of maximum entropy, or total disorder, which corresponds to a stable condition of the system. This stability is maintained until the system receives energy from the outside. In other words, any system degenerates into a state of disorder if left to itself. It is a universal fact that anything that leads to an increase in disorder is more likely to happen than anything that leads to an increase in order. We can understand why by observing the close relationship that exists between disorder and statistical probability. Suppose, for example, that we have 10 cards of the same suit arranged in numerical progression from 1 to 10. This sequence of cards is highly ordered. Now, if we throw the cards in the air, there are thousands of possibilities that they will regroup in a disordered sequence, while there is only one possibility that they will still regroup in their original sequence. Based on pure probability, then, a disordered sequence is much more probable than an ordered one. The second law of thermodynamics can be expressed as follows: the universe, through spontaneous transformations, tends towards the most probable state, which is that of maximum disorder, that is, maximum entropy, from the ancient Greek inside, and trope, transformation. As we have seen, to prevent such degeneration from occurring, it is necessary to supply the closed system with energy from outside, provided that this energy is partly converted into order or used to make the structure of the system more complex. Therefore, the sensible world, visible reality, is made up of physical systems. Some are evolving from less probable states, conditions, to more probable states, random process or disorder. Others are more or less stable, maximum entropy or state of periodic oscillation, through the contribution of energy coming from outside, for example the dissipative systems of Prigogine, Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1997. Still others are evolving from probable conditions towards less probable conditions, open systems, i.e., systems that evolve towards greater structural complexity. These open systems cannot be the consequence of a random process. The cause of such a growth, development, pattern can be only some observable contribution of energy, for example, the growth of a plant on Earth which is powered by solar energy, or even some unobservable, invisible force. We will now consider a system that shows an evolution, from a more probable state to a less probable, more complex, state, the human being. This system, biologically speaking, is in fact the most complex, the most highly ordered, the most structured of all observable physical systems in the universe, in particular thanks to the human brain and central nervous system, which undoubtedly represent the most sophisticated collection of entities in action in the known universe. We can immediately reach a first conclusion: since the human being is the most highly ordered structure in the known universe, it is also the most improbable of all physical systems and the least probable product of a random process. Let us therefore try to take a look at the process that produced the human being, a process that we call evolution. According to the scientific method, the observable facts that give rise to the theory of evolution are those recorded in fossils, found in sedimentary strata at various locations on Earth. Fortunately, there are no contradictions or ambiguities in this fossil record that could create confusion in the interpretation of these data. Examination of these sedimentary layers shows that more complex life forms have replaced simpler, less complex ones. That is, there has been a gradual transition, evolution, from a more probable configuration, structural simplicity and basic disorder, to a less probable configuration, structural complexity and order. There is widespread agreement that our planet has existed for several billion years, 4.5 billion. The first life forms are thought to have been blue-green algae, which most likely appeared about 2 billion years ago. They remained the only life forms on the planet for perhaps a billion years, after which other primordial forms of plant life appeared. Through radiocarbon dating and other methods, it has been established with a high degree of certainty that the first rudimentary forms of invertebrate animal life appeared about 600 million years ago. Therefore, the evolutionary process from unicellular animals and 1,000 other species that arose in the meantime until the appearance of mature man, about 50,000 years ago, lasted no more than 600 million years, which, geologically speaking, is a very short time. The evolution from one species to another was a transitional process, characterized by two aspects. First, the passage from a lower configuration, more probable, less complex, to a higher one, less probable, more complex. Second, the passage characterized by an alternation of periods of stasis and stability, plateaus, with very short periods of rapid change, towards a more complex evolutionary stage. So, evolution is clearly a process over a specific and limited period of time that shows a significant and persistent deviation from randomness, because it has moved from more probable configurations to less probable configurations. Therefore, it is unscientific and irrational to attribute this process to chance. It should also be considered that if this evolution were random, the transition from one species to the next alone would take more than 4.5 billion years. The logic of the scientific method, therefore, requires us to conclude that the process of evolution, not being the result of chance, is the result of the action of some unobservable, invisible, force. In particular, we humans are the end product of evolution and therefore owe our existence to this force. It seems reasonable to call this force God, but those who are uncomfortable with this definition can simply call it the force of evolution, or more precisely, the force that brought about evolution and thereby brought about the human being. It is also particularly reasonable to suppose that the force of evolution is different from all other types of force discovered by science, or hypothesized, because according to current knowledge, no other force could have produced the phenomenon of evolution. Now, just as in the case of the force of gravity, a skeptic can refuse to accept the existence of the force of evolution, choosing to believe that evolution is a random process, a series of highly unlikely coincidences. But in doing so, the skeptic renounces any claim to be acting scientifically or rationally. In fact, from the point of view of the scientific method, one must always choose the most probable of all known logical and possible alternatives. While it is logically possible that evolution is a random process, it is certainly not the most likely of possibilities. Such a skeptic, especially if he is a scientist, should explain why he accepts and follows this basic principle of scientific methodology in every field of research, while making an exception in the case of evolution. If one has no problem believing in gravity or the nuclear force, then why does one place such irrational resistance to believing in the force of evolution? We claim to have succeeded in our intentions of providing scientific proof of the existence of God. We have in fact demonstrated, on the basis of an observable phenomenon, the coming into existence of the human race, that the existence of an unobservable cause is the most reasonable of all known logical possibilities. However, one might ask, to what extent are we justified in calling such an evolutionary force God? Why don't we use the same name God for the gravitational force or the nuclear force? We will now try to answer this question. The identification of the invisible force of evolution with God may seem arbitrary and gratuitous. However, a little reflection will allow us to understand that this is not the case. When we examine the final product, the human being, of the evolutionary force, God, we note that this product is capable of displaying the highest possible degree of acumen, ingenuity, ability, and refinement. We do not call the gravitational or nuclear force God simply because the effects produced by such forces are not as astonishing as those produced by the force of evolution. We may ask ourselves whether it is reasonable to suppose that a force capable of producing an effect like the human being is at least endowed with the same capabilities as man. This hypothesis seems more reasonable than any other logical possibility, if not more so. In fact, we know for certain that this force is capable of doing at least one thing that we humans would never be able to do, namely, bringing the human race into existence. In fact, mankind did not even exist during the entire period in which this force was acting to advance it. We are the result of the action of this force and we owe our existence to it. It created us. According to modern quantum physics, the invisible reality produces the visible one and, in fact, includes and surpasses it. It is therefore logically plausible that it surrounds and surpasses human beings. We know, through experience, that we are endowed with a conscious intellect and a free will. It is therefore not unreasonable to believe that the force or entity that produced us, which is the cause of our existence, may be endowed with faculties such as knowledge, awareness, intelligence, and will superior to our own. The only alternative would be to believe that a blind and unconscious force, devoid of any intelligence, somehow brought into existence an intelligent creature of which it is aware. Man, in fact, is aware of his own intelligence. Man, even if he does not know everything completely, is at least aware of having a subjectivity through which knowledge occurs. This subjectivity is the most basic condition of our existence and is the first, true perception we experience of our life. This subjectivity is the inner space in which each of us lives, and we know that it and our knowledge are the product of the action of the evolutionary force, God. Knowledge of the nature of the evolutionary force, God, that is, the force that created us, can be most properly explored through a deep search for that which is most immediately accessible to us, that is, our subjectivity, that is, our very inner being. It seems, therefore, that our knowledge of the existence and nature of God rests on the most solid of possible foundations. According to the Baha'i faith, the most effective means for attaining self-knowledge and coming to the knowledge of God are the teachings of His manifestations, more commonly known as prophets or messengers of God.